Hello, everyone. Carlos here. So, on today's video, we're going to be talking about the importance of having a threat hunting program. And I have here with me Shane from the IR team that is here to help me with this. How are you doing, Shane?
I'm doing good today. Thanks for having me, Carlos.
Awesome. So, the main topic for the interview is actually talking about why is it so important that you actually have a threat hunting program. I was talking with Shane before we started doing the recording, and we're talking that one of the problems that we're seeing out there is that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are coming out. People are struggling to patch in time. And in addition to that, another problem that we're having is some of them have been exploited for months, even over a year before an actual patch has come out. And then the company has to go like, have we been targeted by this? And the best way of doing that is to actually perform a threat hunt. But many of them have not set up and structure to be able to perform this. So, Shane, tell us a bit about what is threat hunting? How has been your role inside of TrustedSec, performing threat hunts and working with customers to develop threat hunting programs?
Sure. Let me talk first about kind of like a little bit about a threat hunt and kind of get some context around it. Because most people will think of a threat hunt as find bad. Just
Hmm.
tell me what's bad on my network and let's move it, get rid of it or fix it.
Hmm.
And that's not really what a threat hunt is. That's more like a vulnerability scan or just looking for stuff. That has no context. And I always usually tell them if I find bad, that means you're going to have a bad day because now we got to go into
Oh,
incident response and figure out what's going on. Instead, a threat hunt really is about understanding your network from the bottom up, understanding how many hosts you have on your network, inventory, what versions of operating systems, what applications are there, how do they work, what communications is normal, what might be abnormal, where ingress and egress is from. By understanding the context of how your network works, then you can effectively separate the good stuff from the bad, and
hmm.
then threat hunting becomes more kind of like that find bad because you already know what's all good, and that's kind of the core tenet of it. I know a lot of people will say, "Oh, baselining and things like that," and it gets kind of like I know all about that stuff, but it's hard.
Oh yeah.
Anything that's worth actually doing is going to be hard.
And the thing
But
is that you cannot do it at the moment that you think you have an incident. Is that you need to have that baseline already built up, all of that knowledge beforehand.
right, like one of the anecdotes we do is say you come in Monday morning and there a latest vulnerability 0 day type of thing has been released or that becomes aware of.
Hmm.
Your CEO or CIO comes down to your team and says, "Do we have this vulnerability on our network?" If you have no idea where your stuff is or any of your telemetry, you haven't collected it, you can't effectively answer that question. It might be a well, we might have it, or maybe, or something of that nature. Instead, you should be able to go to your machine and go up. Let's pull up the inventory real quick. Oh, this is the application that you're talking about. This is a version. Oh, we have 3 versions of that. They're in these places. We can patch effectively as soon as a patch is available, or we can put up another mitigation. But if you don't have that information, you're just a ticking time bomb, usually waiting for something to happen until you either figure out a patch or, worst case scenario, the patch comes out and you miss the particular area completely because you don't know it exists.
Yeah, I've seen that happen quite a bit when I go to customers and we're talking about building a vulnerability management program, and I tell them, "What is your inventory of hosts?" And go like, "Oh, our source of data is a network scan that we do," and go like, "No, that's not an inventory. You need to know all of your hosts, all of your routers, your switches, your IP cameras. What is the version of software that's running inside of each one of those? Same thing for all of your hosts. And you need to map all of that to your business processes." And that's just the basics. We're not talking S bombs, dynamic S bombs, or any of that stuff. We're just talking about the basics of
No,
you have
you're
an
right.
inventory. And
Yeah,
when
you
it
need
comes to
to.
threat hunting, it is behavior. Like, what is
Yeah,
your
you need to have a complete inventory. A lot of people will say, "Oh, well, we have our inventory is Active Directory, or our inventory is maybe like a vulnerability scan." But that doesn't accommodate, like you said, it doesn't accommodate routers or any devices or things that don't report into the network normally, cameras, video surveillance systems, key badge readers, all that type of stuff, voice over IP phones. That stuff doesn't get included,
Nope.
and the department doesn't think about those type of things. However, when you have an incident or something, those might be it might even be the attack vector that they
Hmm.
come in through, or it could be something that inadvertently gets taken out. Those are the type. I had an incident once, which was more of a mistake by an admin. They inadvertently pushed a patch to the wrong servers, and it took out the key badge readers on the in the office, so
Hmm.
nobody could get into the doors. And it was one of those type of things. But they didn't know what they didn't have their inventory correct.
Oh yeah, and we're seeing it right now specifically with all of the different vulnerabilities that have been coming out for perimeter devices, where we're seeing Juniper vulnerabilities, Fortinet vulnerabilities, we're seeing Pulse VPN vulnerabilities, and all of them are being exploited super fast in environments. And then you go to a customer, have you patched it? And go like, oh, we're 3 versions out. And we now need to go through this convoluted process of patching one version, then to the other, upgrade path. Sometimes they find out that their gear is no longer supported. Uh, I still have not found one single customer in the private sector that actually monitors their networking devices for changes. Uh,
No, we're not seeing it either. And it's funny you should mention that. I just finished an engagement where they had the Cisco AnyConnect, and it
mhm.
was 10 years out of compliance. So when we were talking to them, and
Wow.
it was part of the discovery when we were going through, and we could never ascertain because of logging whether or not the attackers actually compromised the box and used it as its beachhead, or if they just passed through, because there were so many vulnerabilities for that particular device that we didn't know if it was token theft, if they were living off of the device itself, what have you. So that's what you're pointing out is exactly right.
Yeah, that's giving me nervous itches right now because I just came out of a 1 month IR engagement at a customer site, and it was through networking gear that they got in. And I remember going through all of the hoops like, okay, so do we have logs for when the device was modified? No, we don't. Do you have logs of the device itself? Oh, we have some net flow data. And you're like, okay, let's run with that. So it's been eye-opening, I think, the current threat landscape for a lot of customers, because it is showing some areas or gaps that, even though we have been saying that they're being targeted for a very long time, they've never considered. So they're struggling to kind of like get all of the inventory and behavior only from their desktops and their servers. And now you have to add all of the networking devices. And we're seeing attackers kind of like move that way, because right now client machines are becoming harder to exploit given EDR and how it has advanced. The integration of EDR with AV. People are finally getting the importance of logging, and they're logging some of the data, not all of it, but they're starting to log. So now the attackers are going like, okay, so we're going to move to these areas that we know that you guys have been ignoring for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Attackers are always moving, and we've seen that. 6 months ago, they were targeting Office M365 a lot for email, and then they moved over to, like you said, the VPNs were real prominent in the spring. Is when we started getting a lot of calls about it. And now they're starting to patch those. But again, it's about collecting the telemetry, making sure you're patched, because once you get that all done, they're going to move to something else, and that's the thing that you're not
Yeah.
patching. Maybe you don't have good device control for your phones. We've seen that before too. It's just
Mhm.
whatever next thing that they can do. That time horizon between when they find something and when they exploit it is getting shorter and shorter. It just
Yeah.
makes it harder for the defensive team to keep up. And that's why, pivoting back to the threat hunts, if you have a lot of that information already correlated, it makes it easier for you to be able to ascertain those type of things, whether or not you're out of compliance, whether or not you need a patch, whether or not you're even got enough log retention time. It can even be that. We've had logs where they only, especially like a firewall log,
Hmm.
they're pulling it in, but the retention time is only like a day. So we don't, and then the breach occurred 3 days ago, and we're like, well, we can't tell you what happened there because you didn't collect the logs.
Yeah,
So those are
and
the,
the time for setting up all of that stuff is not after the breach, and doing the inventory is not as you're performing the IR. That is wasted time, and that's why I feel it's so important that customers that have a certain level of maturity go through the process of actually building an effective threat hunting program. So, what are the key building blocks when it comes to building a threat hunting program inside of your company?
So we follow the crawl, walk, run kind of philosophy. You start
Mhm.
out with crawl, which is what we've already kind of been talking about kind of like the baselining stuff, understanding what your network, just the assets that are in your network, understand the protocols that are in use in your network. Start to get some of that basic telemetry. Where are your ingress and egress points, and just get a holistic view of the network. That would kind of be more of your crawl.
Mhm.
When we get into what you might say, I'm simplifying these quite a bit, but when you get into more of the walk, is this is where you're collecting log data and you're collecting it from all resources as much as you can and putting them into a centralized logging location. And then as you start to get towards that a little bit more towards the run, now you start to build on that and maybe create some basic alerting, maybe some early functionality to give you reports,
Mhm.
to give you those kind of things so you get some insight into it. Because just collecting data on its own is not enough. It's just it's a morass of data, and then you get overloaded with it. What you need is to start to go, I'm collecting data from this. Now, what am I going to do with it? And what am I looking for? And what was normal and what's not?
Yeah, the
And then
Chinese
that's where you start to get into the run.
so yeah, you run into the Chinese object effect sometimes, where you go like, "Oh, I'm going to collect all of this data." And I remember in one of the IRs, actor was able to move into Active Directory, and I go like, "Okay, let me go into the SIM, let me do a query, give me all of the 4624s, all of the logons for the time frame that we know that the attacker may have been in this server. It was around 24 hours. Give me all of the 4624s." And the query told me, "Oh, I'll have it for you tomorrow." I was going like, why? And then I started looking at indexes and all the data for the SIM, and they were collecting everything from the event log, all of application, all of security, all of everything. I'm going like, that's a problem because now the SIM's struggling. So
Yeah,
knowing what to log is very important.
yeah, and tune it for those type of things. We worked an engagement recently. It was a cloud-based engagement where the developers they're all logging in and creating their own instances and doing what developers do. They were logging all that information, and
Yeah.
it was slowing the sim down. And I was like, you don't need to collect this kind of stuff because it's effervescent. They create it, then they delete it. You need to be focused on the stuff that is security related, like
Yeah.
the IAM logins, the IAM logoffs, where that kind of stuff, so that you can kind of see what's going on when they create administrative privileges, those pieces. And then you could, like I said, you can kind of tune it. And then but you have to know what you're collecting in order to be able to tune it. And that's that crawl, walk, run.
Hmm. So it is kind of like a cycle as you're performing all of your different threat hunts, right? You're performing the exercises and you're gaining a bit more perspective on the logs, and that will give you ideas of where you can trim the fat, where you can do some tuning, where all of a sudden this data is indexed, but this data, after performing a couple of threat hunts, we've noticed, hey, we're not indexing this data. We should index this. So it is kind of like a cycle of improvement then as you're performing the exercises.
Yeah, it's absolutely a cycle of improvement, and it's something that the client has to take away and continue to run with. I give you another instance. They were collecting the client was collecting data from all over. They're collecting Windows logs, they're collecting security logs, they're collecting all this stuff. which was great. We thought that was perfect. But they were also collecting their data lake from Trend Micro, where it was dumping any of its alerting mechanism. And what we basically proposed, I said, first is you're filling up all of your Splunk indexes with this telemetry, but you have a console that will directly access this, and
Mhm.
it's already filtered because these are the alerts that are it's producing. I don't need to take alerts and then put them into another database to search for alerts. Don't collect this. You already have it collected.
Ouch.
Just use your trend main console to be able to do what you need to do. You don't need to actually import it into yet another place. And those are like the little gaps and things like that that we pick up on in tuning, because the first thing like IT departments tend to do is they throw everything in there and then they stop because it's just so overwhelming. Instead, take it in piecemeal. Maybe if you're going to, let's say you're going to take in Windows logs, why don't you
Hmm.
start with the primary servers, Active Directory servers, maybe your application servers, then stop, kind of look through those, tune that a little bit, and then maybe you add a subnet set of logs from Windows machines there, or you add routers, or you add VPN, so you can kind of digest it. And that's that again, crawl, walk, run. You keep
Yep.
building it over and over and over again. And eventually you get a pretty good context about what that is. And when you get finally to the end where you're doing the run, you get two things that really bubble up to the surface. You
Hmm.
get things like dashboards where you can kind of get an overview of what's going on specific to what you're looking for. Plus, if you things that new that come in, say vulnerabilities, or you install, you have patch difference between patches and things like that. You can quickly identify where those things need to go and be able to push them in or report on them quickly because you already have the landscape mapped out.
So what? So they get their inventory. They start identifying what data we should be logging initially. We start logging that data, and once they have that, what would be the next step?
So the first thing is the importance is to centralize it. Is make sure you've got it in a place. The other part about that is once you're logging the data, establish what your kind of your retention policy is going to be. How much data are you going to collect from those? Are you going to have a week, 6 months, a year? What sometimes there's regulations that dictate that, but
Hmm.
however, take that out of context for a second. The other part of it is now that you have those, let's start to look at what you're collected and say, is there anything that here that is abnormal? What is normal? A Active Directory server has a behavioral profile that is significantly different than an application server.
Yeah.
Application servers serve up applications, and you should see telemetry for the application, but you might not necessarily shouldn't see maybe logins, logoffs, or RDP sessions, or other applications that that server is not supposed to do. If it's a database server, why is FTP running on it? You know, those you can identify those from the telemetry that's being collected. And those are the type of things that you would be looking for, and then you're basically building that profile, and then from that profile you establish your baseline, and if anything deviates from that you report on it.
Okay. So and now after you have all of that baseline, would the next step be how planning out? How do you do threat hunting, or is there a step before that?
Once you collect that, the threat hunt can occur at kind of like any stage. It's just as you start to collect things and start to understand. The biggest thing is understanding, and then the once you get to that, you're starting to get into more like the run. And when I'm talking about the run, you're going to go, what is normal, what's abnormal, and then start to describe it. In your mind, you can go to things like, say, the MITRE attack framework, for instance. It lays out a whole bunch of TTPs and attack profiles for actors and how that all stuff works. Look at what it says in there and then take that and go, how would I see that in my network? If this were occurring, if let's say there was, we'll just use an old one like Eternal Blue exploit. How would
Mhm.
that work in my network, which is an older one? Oh, it runs on SMB version 1. Do I have SMB version 1 running in my network? If so, why first? And then the second part is, if I still have it, what servers are running SMB1? What folders would they have access to? What would that all, you start to basically lay out what the attacker would be able to do, and then you
Mhm.
spin back and say, can I detect those things along the way with the telemetry that I'm collecting? And that's basically you're hunting for the threat in your environment based on what you have.
Yeah,
If you don't have any, if you haven't collected any of that stuff, you're not going to be able to do it.
I do remember in one exercise, one of the things I quickly did is I just simply profiled all of the TGT requests. I was going, and then I was mapping source, destination, and options. And I was going like, okay, so let's group them by source. And all of a sudden, I was going like, this source always requests a TGT for this account. This source always requests TT for this two accounts. And all of a sudden, I was seeing some outliers there of requests that didn't match. And then as I look further, I look at the options, and it was always a 408, starting with a 408 in terms of the options and flags for requesting the Kerberos ticket. And then the other ones were five. And I'm like, this is odd. If you've always requested it this way, always from this source, now I'm seeing it from a different source. And it's kind of like the outlier here in the data. And then the options look off. This is something I got to look at. So that was how I kind of like processed that in that case.
Yep, that's a perfect valid kind of threat hunt, and then you can create an alert off of that if you see that type of activity go on.
Mm-hmm.
You can also look for things that maybe you support it within your environment, but it's an abnormal direction. For instance, let's say you have an environment where you have jump hosts. So the administrators are supposed to RDP into specific servers or that are jump hosts, and then they go to the core network. It's a
Mm-hmm.
common tenant so that RDP is not open all the way across the network. However, with that, flip to the opposite. If you detect an RDP protocol request to any other servers other than your jump servers, you know something's up. It's a real
Yeah.
easy detect.
Yeah, the same thing with. I was having this discussion this week. I was talking with someone that was dealing with an incident, and they reached out to me for some advice and stuff. I quickly told them like, you know that all of your jump account, you should have them in the protected users group. That way, you're forcing them all to be Kerberos instead of NTLM. And they were going like, "Oh no, that's too much work. We like
No, it's not.
putting IP addresses instead of FQDNs." And it was going like, why? No, we're used to working this way. Now we got to work this other way. So I also, and that's kind of like to show some of the friction that one may find as one's building out your threat hunting program, and you're finding all of these different issues, and you're going like, oh, we should fix this. There's going to be friction, and I mention it because I also know that we've had customers which get frustrated when we give them recommendations and go like, oh yeah, we're going to implement this, and they start bumping their heads with people not understanding or not wanting to do stuff because they're used to do it one way or the other. That type of frustration is part of the deal. It's part of the game.
Yeah, there's definitely, for lack of a better phrase, kind of like a marketing political side that always goes with this. That's the way security normally works, because anytime you say security, everybody thinks you're going to make my life harder,
Yeah,
and that, it's understandable. So it's there's a different approach. Know your audience first is what you're kind of doing. So let's say it's leadership or senior management. You sell them more on what is the return on investment. Why am I doing this, and why is it good for me and the company? So that's that type of thing. So, and you can sometimes prove that with telemetry that you collect, and other times you can prove it by saying, in the event that this were to occur, this would cost you this amount of dollars in lost revenue or assets or whatever it might be. And then once they can see that from, say, a dollar marketing kind of amount, it makes it a little bit easier for them to understand kind of like why you might be doing that. And getting that buy in from them helps kind of trickle down to other groups.
yeah,
Now, with the other groups, you can do the exact same thing, except it's not an economic thing. It's, I understand this might be a little bit more difficult, but let me help you to make it easier for you to be able to do this? Where do you see the hiccup that's going to make it
Hmm.
harder for you? And maybe I can help it make it easier. Like MFA was not exactly one of the greatest things for the down on personal people. I got to
Yeah.
download an app on my phone. I have a hard token. I have all these type of things that are going on. How are you going to make it easier for me? And the first part is going. We're going to do this in stages, and the next part is
Mhm.
I'm going to handhold you all the way through this until you feel comfortable with it, so that you will turn around and embrace this as part of your daily operation, and you won't it'll just be another tool in your arsenal. And then just kind of like try to present it in more of a positive type of thing, instead of going, oh, we're just implementing new security controls. I get it. I've been on that side. You have to sell it, is really what it comes down to. And if you can't sell it, then you find a representative in your group that can, is
Yeah,
the best I can say for that.
that's why I mentioned that you have to build collateral and then kind of like capitalize on it. Where I've built all of this collateral, now I gotta use it. So I've been
Yep.
accumulating all of this influence, all of this help stuff, and then go like, now I need your help. So
Yeah,
that's
you got political capital, just like in
yeah.
any other group. And again, it's the other thing. Eventually, say like development staff or whatever, they're going to eventually have to come to your groups, whether it be IT proper or IT security. They're going to need something from you,
Oh yeah.
whether it's like, oh, stand up a new server, or I need this, or I need that. Going, you know what? The next time you put in a request, I'll make sure it's expedited for you if you'll help me now. Those kind of things. It's a quid pro quo.
Yeah. So right now we've gone through the exercise of finding the outliers in terms of behavior, how
Yep.
everything has been there. What would be the steps? Let's say we found there's a vulnerability for Fortinet, and we have some of the information on the attack. We probably have proof of concept code, and we want to check if we have been targeted with this type of vulnerability. How would the planning there be?
Okay, so let's say you're at the end, you're at the run stage. So you collect
Mhm.
telemetry, you collect this, you know what version of Fortinet you have, where your patch schedule is. Once you read the whatever the actual vulnerability is, understanding how it is exploited, is it, and then from there, if it is it a vulnerability in the actual application set itself? Is it a vulnerability in a
Mhm.
specific way it connects? Is it a vulnerability in maybe say the actual encryption keys that are used? Find out a little bit more granular detail, and then if there's no patch, then you can do things like you might have to put some kind of mitigation in front of it
Mhm.
beforehand. Maybe if it's a VPN, maybe it's behind a firewall. The firewall has extra. You have to put an extra rule in to say I'm not allowing from wherever. I'm not allowing these type of things. Or maybe I only allow specific users to be able to connect. So and they've got to follow. They got to have a certified uh, corporate laptop in order to be able to connect. You have to understand what it is exactly that the vulnerability piece is that you're dealing with, and then whether or not you have collected the data in order to be able to understand where the vulnerability is, and then put the mitigation in. If it's a patch, if it's you can't patch it, do whatever it is that's best. And then that also gets into the other side of the threat hunting, which is where what's my risk? Is this something that I need to be worried about? Maybe you have a Fortinet firewall. Let's use that as an example.
Mhm.
Maybe that's not. Maybe you use Fortinet firewalls on your interior part of your network and not your perimeter. Does it carry the same risk? And that's part of that whole. How would they get from point A to point B? They
Yeah.
would have to traverse the exterior firewall first, which maybe that's a checkpoint or something. And they're like, oh well, they can't get this. The only way they could get here, they'd have to be on the inside. What would that look like? And then you start to basically game theory it out. What would it look like?
Yeah, it could also be a application that somebody, for example, a vulnerability in Outlook that somebody can abuse to then
Yeah,
get
absolutely.
some NTLM credentials um, for Outlook to connect to the outside world and then expose NTLM credentials. Then you would go like, how would I look at this? What would be the IOCs for this? And then also, and the way I'm seeing it from an attacker's point of view is, what would be the secondary actions that the attacker would take once they have gained access? At some point, if they're living
Yep.
in Outlook, it's temporary. Outlook can go away. So more than likely, they're going to be doing persistence. Once they have persistence, they'll start doing situational awareness, credential harvesting, and those are stuff that I should be looking for. Let's say a regular user in the context of Outlook, I should be looking for that type of exposure in IOCs related to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Your indicators of compromise, your indicators of attack, your actions on objectives, which is what you were just talking about.
Hmm.
That's sometimes even we use that example a lot when it comes to like say ransomware.
Hmm.
Ransomware is always at the end. That's what happens
Yeah.
after the attacker has done everything. Hopefully for you, you might detect them in the middle of whatever they're doing. So like you said, they're trying to escalate credentials. Maybe you detect there, but you have to have these detects that are in place. Maybe it's when they start to actually access servers that normally that account doesn't. There's behavioral. Then what happens when they start to move data across the network? One of the things that we actually did in a tabletop exercise recently for kind of a threat hunt was what happens when you have trusted third party compromise and
Mm.
you have security controls in place which prevent data exfiltration, but they don't. So in this case, what we proposed was the attacker managed to compromise a third party. They VPN'd in because you allow for that. They collected a whole bunch of data, and when they tried to exfiltrate it, they couldn't because your security controls in place didn't allow for it. They just copied it back to their home network and then they exfiltrated it there.
Yeah.
How would you detect that? What would that look like? What would those things mean? And we walked our steps through that. Like, how would they? What would it look like? How would you detect data and transmit back to the home network that they were coming from? And then what would you do about it? Would you shut down the complete access to the company? Would you call them? Do you have litigation? There, that all gets into a whole other set of criteria.
Yeah.
But if you're not, it goes back to the same thing again. If you're not collecting telemetry and you're not thinking about these type of things so that you can effectively identify them and track them, that's what a threat hunt does. It's kind of operationally looking at what could happen. You will never detect it and you won't know it until you find out about it later.
And when it comes to ransomware, many times, one of the things I actually tell customers is that they over focus on the recovery, how fast I can recover after encryption. They're going like, oh, I got encrypted yesterday. I'm going to start recovery tomorrow. And it doesn't work that way. You need to find their beach server. You need to find root cause, how they got in, how they propagated inside the network. How long have they been in the network? So you got to look at all of those IOCs, and all of that stuff is tasks that you have already should have practiced by
Yep.
performing threat hunts. Uh,
Yep, you should have been able to collect it by your telemetry. You should have been able to have alerts in place, track all those type of things. And again, back to ransomware, you mentioned it earlier with the proliferation of EDR and
mhm.
integration with antivirus. It's getting really good at being able to detect the ransomware deploy payload. So what we're seeing is that instead of actual full blown on ransomware, it's mostly the data exfiltration and then the extortion that comes from that part of it going, hey, we have your data, we're going to release it. And then no ransomware ever touches the network. They just stole your data and then
Yeah.
they want to do it that way.
The
They might
double
attempt to
exposure.
deploy it. And usually that's how they get detected is they'll attempt to deploy, the EDR will pick it up and it generates an alert.
Yeah, we're
And then they're like, oh gosh, what happened?
as we were talking about the techniques, they're constantly shifting. If EDR is becoming a problem for me to encrypt, I'm going to move to double extortion, where I'm going to encrypt some systems, but at the same time, I'll have data, and then I'll hold that hostage for you. And now they're and some in some cases they're going like, you know what? Their defenses are so good and so well put in place. I'm not going to try to encrypt the systems. I'm just going to steal as much as possible and then just extort them with the data itself. And then you have to figure out to what they did have access. And it comes back to the inventory. It comes back to, did I log correctly all of the different logons, accesses to share, all of that stuff? Have I performed the exercise? Because you're going to have somebody from legal and also from the board or management breathing down your neck. I want answers now to what did they have access, what was exposed. And you having gone through all of those threat hunting exercises means that you have built a base of procedures already, of queries that you have performed, tuning on the event logs that will allow you then to give those answers a lot quicker, because you're going to be able to look, okay, so we know that they use this account, this account. We know that they access this systems, this systems. This was the abnormalities. And looking at our inventory map to business processes, we know that the data that was in those was X, Y, and Z. So we can tell you with a certain degree of certainty that we know if X, Y, and Z was exposed. And you can
Yeah,
give that
absolutely.
answer a lot faster rather than just spending days and weeks trying just to build all of that stuff out of crumbs in the MFT journal and other different places when logs are not there for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another aspect of that is, and we do this in the tabletops, is for the data exfiltration.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they have a beachhead and they create a big zip file with all the stuff that they've collected as they're moving it out. One of the questions we always ask is, if I give you a file name, do you know where that's located in your network?
Mm-hmm.
And if you do know where that's located, what are the security controls that are in place there? Or if you don't, if it's a share, let's say, now legal might look at that and go, you have to consider every file in there as a compromised file, and what data is in there, and do I have a reportable action on it? Does it have PPI information? Does it have, if you're in medical, does it have HIPAA information? Are we a publicly traded company? Is this a material breach? Now I have to report to the SEC. There's all kinds of things, that ramifications, and the threat hunts become that kind of core principle that kind of funnels that all back in there, so that the pressure is off of IT to deliver answers,
Mm-hmm.
uh, because they can deliver them a lot quicker, and get those things off of their table
Yeah.
and move back to going back to operations as normal.
Oh yeah, and once you are in that situation, you quickly learn about Securities and Exchange Commission Form 8K to say if it
Yes.
was material or not material, and what are you going to say, not say. Um, I've had to deal with that. It's not fun. Also about the files, one of my favorite files that I keep seeing in every engagement is that there's always an ntds.dit.sep or ntds.set file somewhere. And then I'm going like, okay, so when was it created? Can we look and search in the backups to make sure that that file, we can get a date on it? We know that it was there and it was deleted. Now we got to figure out when was it created, and you got to go through all of that exercise of trying to find that, and then you go like, oh, so that file was X amount of megs. Do we have the logs on the firewall that we know? Hey, somebody exfiltrated this amount in a burst or something to the outside, and to where. And that's why it's so important to have all of this stuff set up beforehand. So, what do we offer customers to help them prep for this in terms of training and services?
So we have there's a 2 day class that we teach periodically. Actually, it's going to be taught at Black Hat again this year, which gives you kind of like the basics, kind of like what we've talked about here. So the first day of the course usually talks about all these baseline and what crawl, walk, run type of thing, and then what we do is the second day you get a bunch of like PCAPs and
Mhm.
some information, and then you start to kind of build what a threat would look like and how you would kind of map it out in order to build basically a threat profile for that particular thing that you're doing. So that's just kind of like a quick intro to that. However, we do have another service, which is more of a threat hunting build program.
Mhm.
And then the threat hunting build program, we work with the client directly over a course of time and say, okay, where are you currently at in your maturity model? And then we start to build from there to get them to crawl, walk, run. Maybe they're already crawling,
Mhm.
and then we can go, okay, we have some core stuff here to work with. Let's get you to walking. And then from there, maybe we'll get you a little bit closer to running. Now, we're not going to do it from soup to nuts for every single piece of your thing. We're going to give you the line to get you, these are the steps. Now you just need to rinse and repeat for all the other parts, for your routers, your switches, your perimeter security, your applications. So, but you have basically you have the foundational pieces to build there from there. The last piece that we do, which is just it's a normal, we call it a threat hunt engagement,
Hmm.
is where you give us access to your telemetry that you collect. Let's say it's Splunk or some other type of a SIM, and then we look at what we start looking through the data and identify things that we hunt for specific to whatever the client's looking for. For instance, like if it's I'm trying to think of it, like we do ones with cloud. So we'll look through like the guard duty logs and we'll look through them and go, okay, here's what we see that's active, that's going on in your network. These parts look like they're normal. These parts are something that we see as an attack profile from MITRE,
Hmm.
and we map it back to the MITRE's attack framework and say, let's take a look at these and see what you have to say about them. And that's so those are kind of like the three areas. So we have regular threat hunts that we call, those are more for our that usually occur over a week or 2 weeks where we look at your data. We have the threat hunting build program, which occurs over a little bit longer period of time. And then we have like the 2-day course type of thing where we just give you some basic information, but we don't touch your network or anything. We just teach you kind of how we would start to put it together and give you elements of each portion so that you understand it.
Yeah, another one is to remind customers that it's important to have a retainer in place for when all of a sudden you can have that there and you can just break glass and go like, hey, I think we probably could have been targeted by this. I'm going to use my retainer hours for you guys to do a threat hunt exercise in my environment to try to see if we've been targeted while we focus all of our internal efforts on getting everything patched or everything set up as we should be doing. Because I've seen a lot of customers sadly come to us going like, hey, I think I've been breached, and they forget that there's this legal process, PO be in place, all of that that could take days before we're able to actually help them in an emergency. And having those retainers actually do provide a lot of value for them when that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you become a retainer client, it gives you well, first there's an SLA that's
Mhm.
applied to that, so we have to respond within a certain period of time. But it also by having a retainer in place, we've had a chance to have contact with the client, understand kind of a little bit about say their network, not on a deep level, but just understand what they're working with, and then that we get point of contacts from their side, they get point of contacts from our
Mhm.
side, and it makes the whole process of getting from hey we need help to hey we're helping quicker. If you don't have those things in place, like you already pointed out, we have to wait for a contract to be signed, we have to wait for all these other pieces, and then we can help you. In the meantime, we're just gonna talk to you on the phone and go, well, we can help you when we can.
Yeah,
And
we're just
that's
gathering
not always
information
optimal.
until we can actually just sit down and start working on it. So we're just
Right.
in collection phase, like, okay, so while you guys work that, what else have you seen? Oh, no, don't send me files yet, but at least tell me over the phone because there's a lot of legal processes and constraints that we have to work around that. And that's why many times when I talk with customers, I tell them it's important for you to at least have a retainer in place. And if you don't consume the hours because you didn't had an incident, you can use that probably for training, and you can take the threat hunting program training, or
You
you
might be
can
able to do that.
or you can use it or you can use it for a service where at the end of the year we can go like, hey, you have this hours with the IR team. The IR team has another service which is helping you build out a threat hunting program. You can use those hours as credit for that service and you can leverage that. But I'm always recommending like have a retainer in place. Uh,
Yeah, like you said, you can convert them.
Mhm.
Like maybe you convert it over to a tabletop, which is kind of like you're running through the scenario, and then we would ask you the same type of questions. How would you detect this? What would it look like? How would you
And,
respond? The threat hunts don't always get into the whole "how would you respond" type of stuff. It's just you're looking for the data. But yeah, I mean, it's actually that.
and
What's
those are
disclosure
so
look like? How to
interesting.
clients?
Tabletops are so interesting. I've been a fly on the wall on a couple that you guys have done. and I see some of the answers, and when you go like, no, you have the wrong notion there. Let us tell you how some of this stuff will actually play out in real life. And you can see the panic in their eyes going like, oh, I didn't thought about that. Oh, that can happen. Tabletop exercises are eye openers for a lot of customers, especially when they're dealing with third parties, and we're doing the exercise with their third parties or their partners, and they go like, "Oh, you guys never considered having a alternate communication plan in place.
Yep,
What
absolutely.
what happens if your Office 365 is compromised?" And they're going like, uh, I go like, WhatsApp, Signal, Wire. How are you guys going to
Yeah,
communicate,
how do you do out-of-band
coordinate?
communications? Any of that type of stuff. If you need to do disaster recovery type of stuff, how are you going to make contact with people? Tell them not to come into the office today,
Yeah,
or whatever it might be. The VPN's down. How do you communicate with them?
yeah,
How do they get into the network? What do you do? Those are, yeah, all those type of topics that we kind of cover. It's usually laid out in a specific scenario related to what the client wants to kind of push. But yeah, absolutely, we do all kinds of stuff for any type of security type of event you want to talk about. We can put something together.
yeah. Cool, Shane. I really appreciate the time. And I'm going to be putting in the description of the video several links to the different services that we offer. And
Absolutely,
yeah, keep in touch, and let's see. And I'll see you guys in the next video.
absolutely. All right, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.